Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hello. Welcome back to another day with A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and it is my joy to walk with you through the Gospel of Mark. Today, we will be in Mark 11. In Mark 11, we saw Jesus enter and inspect the temple, and then enter it again and start flipping over tables. At the end of the chapter, he entered the temple a third time, where his authority was challenged by religious leaders. And here in Mark 12, we are going to see several more confrontations between Jesus and the leaders of the temple, all within the temple. Jesus first tells a parable about a man and his vineyard. The parable is a bit on the nose because verse 12 says that the authorities know that Jesus is talking about them. In this parable, a man plants a luxurious vineyard and then hires tenants to tend to it while he's away. The man then sends a servant to collect some of the vineyard's fruit, but the tenants beat him and then send him away. The vineyard's owner sends another servant, and then another, and then another. Some servants are beaten, and others are killed. Finally, the vineyard owner sends his own son, and yet the same thing happens. The owner's response, Jesus says, will be to destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Like the fig tree in Mark 11, a vineyard was an Old Testament metaphor for Israel. In Isaiah 5, for example, God spoke of Israel as a vineyard that he loved. Like the man in the parable here, God had dug up the ground and carefully planted Israel. In fact, Isaiah 5:4 says that he couldn't have done anything more for the vineyard. And yet, when he came looking for good fruit, he only found bad fruit. Isaiah 5:7 says that while God looked for justice among his people Israel, he only found injustice. And while he looked for righteousness, he only heard cries of despair. And so his response would be to destroy the vineyard. There are clear echoes here between Isaiah 5 and the parable that Jesus tells, which is probably what clued the religious leaders into what Jesus was saying. The point is something similar to the cursed fig tree. The religious leaders of Israel are not bearing fruit, and therefore judgment is coming. They are corrupt, and they have not led the nation of Israel to a pure worship of God, and so their time watching over God's vineyard is coming to an end. After this comes a question of whether it's okay to pay taxes to Caesar or not. Here is the trap. If Jesus says, yes, pay taxes to Caesar, this could alienate Jesus from the crowds who resented Rome. Remember, the crowds loved Jesus, and it is this love that prevented the authorities from arresting him in verse 12. If they can turn crowds against Jesus, great. But if Jesus says, no, don't pay taxes to Caesar, then this would make Jesus an enemy of Rome. He might appear to be an insurrectionist, and the Roman authorities would take care of him. But Jesus takes a middle path. He says, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but to God the things that are God. Caesar can have that which bears his image, their coins, but give to God what bears his image. And what bears God's image? Human beings. So Caesar can have your money, but give yourself to God. In a similar vein, Jesus is asked by one of the teachers of the law what is the most important commandment. In response, Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. That is, give all of yourself to God. And secondly, to love your neighbor as yourself. The man who asked Jesus seemed genuinely curious. He appreciates Jesus' answer and says, you're right. This love for God and for others is far more important than all the burnt offerings. He recognizes that it's possible to go through all the motions of obeying the Old Testament laws and to completely miss their essence, love. This chapter also contains a conversation in which Jesus refutes the Sadducees' beliefs that there is no resurrection, and a conversation in which, using Psalm 110, he shows his opponents that the Messiah will be far more than just a human Messiah. As it wraps up, though, Jesus offers a warning about the scribes. Beware of them, because they like to be seen as important. They like to look pious, but it's all a facade on the inside. Instead, they are the kind of people who harm the vulnerable. Specifically, they devour widows' houses. As if to illustrate this, the chapter ends with such a widow putting a tiny amount of money, all that she has, into the temple treasury. This story is often seen as an example of generous giving. But we need to remember what Jesus just said about the authorities devouring widows' houses, and the whole context of Mark 11 and 12 of Jesus inspecting the temple and finding no fruit. Instead of living out the great commandments to love God and others, the religious authorities have reduced this vulnerable woman to the last 2 of their coins. And now she has nothing. Instead of caring for her, they have exploited her. And that is the sort of final straw for Jesus, who will pronounce his verdict on the temple in chapter 13. As we read about Mark 12, let's behold a couple of things about Jesus. First, again, let's behold what we talked about yesterday, that Jesus gets angry at empty religion that likes to look pious, but then rob the vulnerable, like this widow. We should rejoice that he is protective of the vulnerable. And then let's consider how he sums up the entire Old Testament law as love for God and love for others, and also that he embodies that love himself. He perfectly demonstrates what James describes in James 1:27 when he writes that pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.